Hi everyone. Like Noel said, my name is Kim. I'm the curator here, and I'm going to talk to you about the current exhibit at the museum on the clock, Changing the Industrialized World. Um, and of course, everything is not going to work for me. Hold on one second. There we go. So I'm going to start off by giving a little bit about the concept and how we got to where we are, how we got to the exhibit that we have. So first thing to talk about is the collection. We actually received a large donation of time recording clocks from the Edward Watkins Family Foundation, many of which are actually in the exhibit themselves. If anybody's familiar with the name Edward Watkins, he was actually the founder of the Simplex time recording company. We also used a daytime recorder that was used at the York Paper Factory, which is local here in Pennsylvania, and also some objects from the museum to kind of round out the exhibit. So the idea began as a chronological look at the evolution of the workday. And as that idea evolved, it began to take shape in the form of a look at the labor movement in America, using the time recorders as accents to tell the story of what brought us to the modern workday and where we may be going in the future. It's meant to give the visitors a look at how something that is relevant to everyday life sort of evolved. We've all had to either sign in or clock in using a time recorder or a sign-in sheet, some kind of way to let our employers know that we were actually there working. So the exhibit itself starts by giving the visitor a chance to clock in to the exhibit and clock out at the end. The exhibit, by using a state-of-the-art biometric facial recognition scanner graciously donated by Latham. It should be noted, though, that we have rigged the scanner so that it does not record any images of the visitors, but rather still allows them the opportunity to try out something state-of-the-art. What's ironic is 2 feet behind that state-of-the-art recorder is the Haywood #1, which is in the image on the left-hand side. And that was created for the Haywood Brothers Company Engineering Department in 1888 by Edward Watkins. It's operated by a push button, but has no bell or clock face to let the worker know that they have actually clocked in properly. And it also works by a pin pricking mechanism on a paper dial, which was typical for the time. Watkins actually really did not like this design. He thought it was clunky and it was hard to use, honestly. So he never actually patented it. He realized that they would need about 100 of them just to be able to account for all the employees in one department of Haywood Brothers. So what he did is that in 1894, after many years of tweaking his design, he came up with the clock on the right-hand side, and that is the Simplex time recorder. This one is actually a Model 0 30-person recorder. He named it the Simplex because it was so simple to use. Its improvements had a bell and a clock face so workers could check the recorded time. But it ran on a long cylinder that increased the number of people that the clock could handle. The original 60-beat mechanism was then replaced with a 100-beat Seth Thomas Marine movement. Back when this came out, it actually sold, this specific model, the 30-person, originally sold for $35. The 50-person model, or the #1, originally sold for $50, and the 100-person model, or the #2, originally sold for $75. So they were considered pretty pricey for the time, but still fairly reasonable. So as using the time recorders to accent the labor movement in America, I'd like to give you a brief overview of what the typical workday in the 19th century would have looked like. We're so used to our modern workday that we don't realize how hard it was 100 years ago or so. So the workday begins at 4 a.m., where you have to wake up in order to punch in on time, because if you were late, there's a very good chance you would be fired. By noon, you were given a short break for lunch, probably the only one you would have that day. 6:30 p.m. you are not giving a break, but you must eat, so you eat at your desk or your workstation, wherever you are. 9 p.m. your shift technically ends, but you're probably going to stay a few hours later. By 11 p.m. you actually leave because there's a good chance you've had to meet your quota for the day. At that time, if you did not complete your work as you were supposed to, it was a very good possibility that the employer could charge you for the work you did not do. In those days, workers were subject to poor working conditions and extremely low wages. Employers discovered that they could maximize their profits by making employees work an average of 10 to 16 hours a day. To them, this maximized output for as little spent as possible, thus increasing profits. This actually resulted in strikes and protests to begin across the country, and it led to the creation of labor unions, which I'll talk about in a little bit, government legislations, and a forced change to get us to where we are today. So, time recorders and the beginning of the labor movement. I'll give you some the companies that were primarily used during this time. In 1885, the Bundy Clock Company was established and later was incorporated as the Bundy Manufacturing Company. In 1892, John Day developed the patents for Alexander Day, and you have the Day Time Recording Company. In 1894, Edward Watkins actually patents his simplex time recorder. By 1900, Bundy merged with a company known as Willard and Frick to become International Time Recording Company. They also later acquired Day Time Recording Company. By 1916, Simplex acquired Bundy. By 1924, International Time Recorder became International Business Machines, or IBM. In 1979, Kronos Inc. developed the first time recording system to use a microprocessor, or a computer. The late 20th century saw computer-based attendance systems using magnetic strips, barcode scanners, and other means to have employees clock in or clock out. Presently, the rise of iPhone and tablet technology is where many employers have seemed to gone, and these are also known as smart clocks. In the future, it seems that there's going to be a rise of biometric timekeeping, and I will also talk more about biometrics at the end. So because of its association with the Industrial Revolution in America, the time recording clock became a symbol of the labor movement, especially the Bundy clock. It became a symbol of unfair working conditions, poor pay, and the inability to better oneself. In 1791, Philadelphia carpenters rallied and striked for a 10-hour workday. In 1836, publications began to rally behind an 8-hour workday, which was later achieved for the first time by non-unionized shipbuilders in Boston. 1867, Illinois passed an ineffective 8-hour workday bill, resulting in a citywide strike. New York City followed shortly when 100,000 workers striked, and they won an 8-hour workday. In 1886, we had the first May Day parade, which later became known as Labor Day, and at that time, 80,000 people protested down Michigan Avenue in Chicago. Soon, 350,000 workers in 1,200 factories around the country began to strike, many having their demands met. So, some of the things that the time recorder clocks have seen that have led to where we are, some of them are not exactly what we would consider good. So I'm going to start with child labor. This began in the 19th century. Well, not that it began in the 19th century. It was popular in the 19th century. It was not uncommon to see young children working alongside adults in dangerous and poor conditions. They were really valued by employers because they were viewed as cheaper and more manageable, and their smaller size allowed them to reach into tighter spots. They also were less likely to strike. By the early 20th century, labors performed by children peaked at 19%, when 19% of the workers in America were under the age of 16. They worked in the same horrible conditions for even less pay, and they did not go to school. Pretty quickly, groups formed to protect these children. Massachusetts in 1836 required children under the age of 15 to attend school 3 months out of the year. In 1842, the workday for children was lowered to 10 hours in certain states. In 1924, the first attempt to regulate child labor in America was actually shot down by the government because it was deemed unconstitutional. In 1936, the Welsh-Healey Act stated that the United States would not purchase anything made by children under age. And in 1938, the Federal Labor Standards Act, which I will talk about, finally regulated the labor laws, including child labor. But child labor was on the way out anyway. The need for children in the workplace was reduced because of advancements in machinery, which required more specialized training and higher education. This led to states increasing the number of years of schooling required, lengthening the school year, and enforcing truancy laws more efficiently. Time recorders didn't just witness the rise and fall of child labor, they also saw the rise and fall, or the rise of labor unions in America. Not the fall, they're still around. Because of new technologies of the time, including the light bulb, workers were able to work longer hours. Before any labor laws, workers could be expected to clock in 12 to 16 hours, 6 to 7 days per week. Needless to say, they were not happy about that. So many of them started forming groups to help each other decide their priorities. We know them today as labor unions. The advantages of this was to negotiate contracts and determine terms of employment, including health care, pensions, hours, leave, health and safety, etc., through a process called collective bargaining. Then this is where employees were able to jointly decide their priorities. Though labor unions were never officially illegal, in the first half of the 19th century, 23 cases in 5 states saw indictments and prosecutions for criminal conspiracy to increase wages by labor groups. And by 1842, it was declared that employees had the right to strike peacefully. Unfortunately, strikes were not always peaceful. The Homestead Strike of 1892 was one of the bloodiest ones in America. It took place in Homestead, Pennsylvania, which is the home of Andrew Carnegie's famous steel mill. Carnegie decided that he was going to take a little break and go back to his native land of Scotland. And he left a gentleman by the name of Henry Clay Frick in charge of all operations regarding his steel mill. Frick was kind of known as a hothead, stubborn, quick to anger kind of guy, and he immediately began slashing wages and increasing hours to meet the demand for steel. At this time, Carnegie had just signed a deal with the U.S. military to provide the steel for the Navy. As a result of all this, the employees under Frick began burning images and likenesses of him in effigy. And then they decided to strike. In response, Frick promptly built a 12-foot high fence around the compound, aptly named it Fort Frick to keep the workers in line. It did not work. The workers managed to take over the mill, which forced Frick to call in the Pinkerton detectives. The Pinkertons at this time were essentially guns for hire, and they arrived by the hundreds on barges down the Monongahela River, which is a river right alongside Homestead Steel Mill. A resulting 14-hour firefight left 3 Pinkertons and 9 union workers dead. And the strike lasted for 4 months, and at that time the workers were able to return to work, defeated. The leaders were charged with murder. 160 others were given lesser charges. But this was really part of the beginning of the growth of labor unions in America. But big clunky time recorders were not the only things that were in use at this time. Watchman's clocks were also a way that employers used to keep track of employees. Watchman's Clock was a portable way for employers to make sure that both the watchman and the employee were at a particular station at a given time. Prior to any device invention that could automatically clock someone in and out of their job, watchmen would physically walk from station to station to make sure everyone was working and accounted for. These clocks were used every time a certain station was visited and was meant to not only keep the employee in line, but the watchman as well. They had to make sure they were in a certain place at a certain time or risk getting fired. So government legislation was then put in order to help employees at this time, starting in the mid-20th century. Excuse me, by 1935, people began to really push for a consistent workday, better pay, and rights they didn't have at the time. And this led directly to the National Labor Relations Act, or the NLRA. It was the first real definitive step in creating a set of laws that would protect the rights of the employee. This didn't necessarily protect every employee, but it did give them the right to bargain collectively, and if they so chose, they could join, form, or assist a labor organization without the threat of an employer retaliating against them, discriminating them for it, or interfering with them in any way. 3 years later, we have the Federal Labor Standards Act in 1938. And the NLRA led directly to this. Without this, we would not have any minimum wage, we wouldn't have any overtime pay, which was listed as 1 1/2 times the person's hourly wage, or as we know it, time and a half. And it also regulated child labor, stating that children under the ages of 18 could not do certain dangerous jobs, while children under the age of 16 could not work during school hours. FDR actually called it the most important piece of government legislation of the New Deal. Without this law, we would have none of the rights that we have today. So where are we going to go from here? As mentioned previously, we have iPhone and tablet technology that has been on the rise. And that has been where many of the up-to-date time clocks have been for the moment. But biometric time clocks are definitely on the rise. And biometrics is actually not a new concept. It was in use, Biometrics, first of all, is the use of a physical trait such as a fingerprint, retina and face scans, DNA, or any other physical features to identify an individual. It actually began around 1850, the idea of using fingerprints to identify somebody, when a British magistrate realized that each fingerprint was unique. He was followed by Sir Francis Dalton, who created a method for classifying fingerprints, a method that we still use in modern forensic science. After 9/11, biometrics was a means of identification, increased in use when the Department of Homeland Security spent $133 million on research. Surprisingly, though, the government does not have the largest database of biometric or facial scans in the world. Actually, Facebook does. And this is used primarily in photo tagging, but their database is enormous. But biometric time clocks are growing exponentially in use throughout the United States and around the world, especially in the workplace. And the use of biometric time clocks has become a safe and secure way for employers to keep track of workers' hours. There is a problem with biometrics, though, when it comes down to privacy. Employers must make sure that they tell their employees that they are going to be using a biometric time clock and allow them the opportunity to refuse to use it if they so choose. So employers have to have a backup plan in case an employee decides that they don't want to use it for any reason whatsoever. Some of it can be privacy, some of it could be personal, others could be religious. But biometrics, yeah, is pretty much on the rise, and I think we'll be seeing a lot of more of biometrics in the future. So that was pretty much it. I want to thank everybody for listening to the talk, and I also want to thank the Edward Watkins Foundation, who provided a lot of the timepieces, and anybody else who downloaded, or anybody who donated to the exhibit. Also, I want to thank everyone who took the time out tonight to listen to this talk. And I guess I'll take questions if anybody has any.
Hi, this is Noel Poirier again, Museum Director. I'm going to read a couple of questions that came across during the course of this. We want to apologize if somebody's had issues with the audio tonight. I think we've had a person mention that they've been having problems with the audio. We apologize for that. We tried our best to make sure all of the technology was working correctly this evening. Let's see here. One of the questions that we got, which I think we might have answered, was how or when did the Cincinnati Time Recording Company begin? And Kim, I don't know if that's something you can answer or if you think I should do that, but it's up to you.
I believe it began about 1896. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, as to how,
well,
I don't have the answers
as
right
I
away.
understand it, there's actually a modern company which has its roots with the Cincinnati Time Recording Company, but I think it actually had something to do with Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati. And I think that Mr. Gamble helped this particular doctor that he had who had a clock business, and then they ended up starting what's called the Cincinnati Time Recording Company, but I think you're right, I think it's 1896. Other question that came up, which is more in line with the labor issues questions you were talking about, was did any of the labor acts, like the Labor Relations Act or the Federal Labor Standards Act, create the Department of Labor?
The Department of Labor was actually created through the Federal Labor Standards Act.
Okay.
So in 1938 is around the time that came into practice.
One of the things that comes up is the complexity. Can you speak to the development and the complexity of time recording cards or punch tape or et cetera, or the technology that was used to actually record the employee's time?
The cards themselves?
Yeah, or no, the complexity of how the time recorder cards and the punch tapes and all of that kind of developed over time. Because you mentioned that the simplex, the early simplex, was just a piece of paper with a pin prick, but then what happens kind of after that?
Well, I think the time recording cards themselves had to advance with the time recorders, and they still had to be as simple to use as possible. Most of the time, at least in my research, it seems that they essentially are a card that ends up getting printed on somehow, either by a push button or a stamp, or putting the card through a reader. But as we get into the modern era, they kind of faded out a little bit as technology sort of progressed. We kind of lost the need for cards themselves. A lot of the time we can use our cell phones or a fingerprint scanner or something we can put a code into to say that we're there.
One of the things I can speak to is just we have a punch clock that our visitors to the museum can clock in and out on when they come to the museum, and it's a Latham punch clock from about I think it's 1990s, early 2000s. And I have to change that whenever the time change happens. I have to go in there and take it off and change all the wheel and all the time on it. And what I'll tell you about that 21st century Latham time clock is the technology inside of that is not that dramatically different than some of the 19th and early 20th century time clocks in terms of how it actually imprints the time on the card that a visitor has. It's a tape, an ink tape, a piece of paper, and essentially a typewriter kind of setting. So I don't know that from a mechanical standpoint, once you started printing on the cards, there's not a dramatic, doesn't appear to be a dramatic change. There's a change from pinpricks to printing, and now there's this change that Kim has addressed from the printed card or the printed record to a more electronic record or a facial recognition record, which is kind of frightening. But there's been kind of middle period where it doesn't seem like the technology has changed that much. Steve asks if we've got a Corbett's time clock. It's an English clock that you deposit a token in, and it falls into a late or on time collection box. And I don't know that we have one, but you might. I don't know. I know there's not one in the exhibit, correct?
Correct. I don't recall seeing one in our collection.
Yeah, and I don't think one came with the Watkins collection either when we got that.
No.
Okay. I'm reading another.
Take your time.
Robert talks about the English patent about John Adams' time recorder using tokens with employee numbers. I've heard of that. Yes. I can't tell you. I can't tell you any more than that. I know I've heard of it, but I haven't researched that one in depth at all.
Yeah, me either.
Right, exactly. We do have a Rochester, William Bucher. We do have a Rochester on exhibit in the exhibit that uses a time card. It's one of the earliest Rochesters we have, and that did come from the Watkins gift. So yes, you were correct there. I want to let everybody know that this webinar will be put online. We'll actually, once we get finished and edited it out, we'll upload this to the museum's YouTube channel as well as to the NAWCC website, so folks can watch it again at their leisure, particularly if you had any technical issues this evening. If we didn't get a chance to answer your question over the air, we will be happy to shoot you an email with an answer. And I'd like to thank everybody who joined us this evening. I hope you'll all come to the exhibit, come to the museum and pay us a visit. It's really a wonderful collection that Ed Watkins has donated to us and that we've managed to accumulate here on our own as well. And I hope that some folks will take a chance to actually visit the exhibit. Kim, thank you very much for coming out here on a Sunday evening, and thank all of you for spending a Sunday evening with us. I hope that you have a great evening and a great week. Thank you very much.